Hey folks, this is a short lesson that will take place at the end of section 8.2. So if you could get out your notes from section 8.2, go all the way down to the bottom of the notes from section 8.2. And I want to take a look at the part that talks about all students take calculus. You'll notice here that I have in bold the A, the S, the T, and the C. All students take calculus. These letters are each going to stand for all. So the A in all is going to stand for all. The S in students is going to be standing for sine and sine's partner, which is cosecant. T in take will be for tangent as well as tangent's partner. And then C in calculus will stand for cosine, which also includes cosine's partner, secant. So what we want to take a look at is I want to know in each quadrant which of these trig functions are positive and which of these trig functions are negative. You'll remember from some of the other conversations that we've had, sine is going to be the y value divided by the r value or the radius value. So if you could, imagine that maybe I have a triangle inside of the first quadrant, a right triangle, where this is my y value, this is my x value, and then my radius value is going to be that hypotenuse. This is a right angle, even if it doesn't really look very much like a right angle. Now, we know that sine of theta, and theta is always at the origin, we know that sine of theta is always going to be the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. Well, since the opposite is my y value, and the radius is always going to be positive, my y value in the first quadrant is going to be positive. And I'm going to erase this triangle simply because at the moment it's in our way. And we know that sine being y over r in the first quadrant is going to be positive. Now, anytime sine is positive, cosecant is also going to be positive. Well, let's go to the other quadrants. Let's look at quadrant 2, which is this quadrant right in here. And so quadrant 2, my y value, which is still connected to my sine value, my y value is still going up. So that's a positive y value in the second quadrant. And maybe it would be easier if I drew for you a small reference triangle over here on the side. So next we'll go to the third quadrant. And in the third quadrant, if I have a triangle, I know that my y value in the third quadrant is going to be negative because it is going down. So in the third quadrant, we have a negative sine value. And then in the fourth quadrant, once again, I have a y value that's going down. And since I have a y value that's going down, it is also negative. Now let's go back and do the cosine values. Cosine is going to be the adjacent over the hypotenuse, the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So if I use a different color here and I draw another triangle, a different triangle in first quadrant, my adjacent value in the first quadrant divided by my radius, first quadrant, that's going to be a positive value. So cosines in the first quadrant are always going to be positive. In the second quadrant, however, if you draw a triangle over in the second quadrant, you'll notice that your x value is now going to the left. And so since x's are going to the left, those are negative values. So a negative on the x over a positive radius will be a negative in the second quadrant. Third quadrant, I still have an x value that's going to the left, so it'll be negative. Cosine will be negative as well as secant. And then if you go back to the fourth quadrant, once again in the fourth quadrant, I still have a positive x value. It's going to the right, so my cosine values will be positive. Now, a couple of ways to think about your tangent values. Remember that we've discussed that tangent is going to be the opposite over the adjacent, or the y value over the x value. And so really what I need to look at now is just simply the combination of the y values and the x values that I'm going to have here. So we'll go with purple. And when you look at the first quadrant, my y value over my x value, and really you could even say the sine value divided by the cosine value, positive divided by positive, is going to be positive. In the second quadrant, the y value divided by the x value, y is positive, sine is positive, divided by the x value, which is negative. So a pos divided by a neg is going to be a negative. Down in the third quadrant, both values are negative. So y divided by x is going to be a negative divided by a negative, which we know is positive. And then lastly, in the fourth quadrant, sine divided by cosine, or y value divided by x value, is going to be a negative divided by a positive, which is negative. And now that we see this, we can tell what our All Students Take Calculus actually stands for. So the A in all is simply because all the values are positive in first quadrant. In the S, so we're going to the second quadrant, we're going to work our way around. The S for second quadrant simply means that only the sign is positive. So all means first quadrant, all are positive. The S means only the sign is positive in the second quadrant. In the third quadrant, only the tangent is positive. So I'm only naming things that are positive. I'm not naming things that are negatives. And then lastly, let's see here, we'll use yellow. The C for calculus is going to be cosine being positive. So all students take calculus is an acrostic that names what is positive. All in the first quadrant, only sine in the second quadrant, only tangent in the third quadrant, and only cosine in the fourth quadrant. Now, let's actually put this into practice and see how this might be useful. So you'll notice that on number 72, we've got some mathematical symbols here. First of all, it says that sine theta is greater than 0. Now we know that greater than 0 is the same thing as saying it's positive because only numbers greater than 0 are positives. Same thing with the tangent. So what this is asking is, in which quadrant do both of these things occur at the same time? Well, where is sine positive? Well, that's going to occur in the first quadrant because everything's positive in the first quadrant. And it also occurs in the second quadrant because sine is a y value. So these are the two quadrants where sine is positive. Now let's go find the quadrants, and there are more than one, the quadrants where tangent is positive. Again, I know that tangent is positive in the first quadrant because everything's positive in the first quadrant. And then I also know that tangent is positive in the third quadrant. The only overlap that I have is in the first quadrant. So when the directions say identify the quadrant, well, this is going to be in quadrant 1. We will work the rest in class. Have a great night.